in today's noisy, fast-paced world, your judgment is really at a premium, more than ever before. And the odds are stacked against great decision-making. Why? Because we tune out what really matters when we should be tuning in. But if you learn how to tune in, you not only prevent predictable error, but you improve lives and livelihoods, and you stand out rather than lose out. So I'd like you to meet Dick Bass. Has anybody here ever heard of Dick Bass? One or two have heard of Dick Bass. Well, Dick Bass is the first man to have climbed 7 summits across 5 different continents, and a local hero by all accounts. And not shortly after this, he took a flight. And as you do on your average flight, you take a seat, you kind of size up the person beside you and take a look, as he did. And he sat down and he started to regale this passenger about all of his exploits, whether it was to Kilimanjaro or to Denali. And the reserved gentleman nodded politely, didn't say too much. 2 hours passed. They kept talking. About to land, they suddenly decide, time for to exchange pleasantries. And Dick says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your name." And the gentleman says, "Oh, that's okay. My name is Neil Armstrong." That is a true story. How often have we been like Dick Bass, so tuned into our own voices that we miss opportunities, that we miss the insights and experiences of other people? Now, it may not matter on your average flight, but it absolutely matters when you hold power and you're in a position of authority. And what happens is that we basically tune out far too much. And the World Economic Forum talks about misinformation risk, and it calls it the #1 risk facing this generation. What it certainly does not talk about is human decision risk, and which is arguably more important, or at least as important, as political, economic, or climate risk. And at the end of the day, this stops and starts with us. We hear less than ever, we misjudge a lot more than ever before. This isn't just about who you hear, but it's also about who hears you. And Harvard suggests that your decisions are no greater than a coin toss, which isn't exactly the way forward. And this happens because, as I said, we tune out of different voices. So we hear the first voice, the fastest voice, the loudest voice, the most senior voice, sometimes the most popular voice, rather than the right voice when we're making decisions. And how often do we listen to the most familiar voice rather than the mavericks or the minorities or even the moaners? So we jump to conclusions, accept things at face value, which we've heard earlier on. We encode messages rather than decode messages. We like sound bites and slogans rather than taking the time to reflect and decode and reinterpret what's heard. And ultimately, we trust what we hear, and we trust what we selectively hear. And we do this in several ways. We hear what we want to hear. And ultimately, you may hear promises of promotion or get-rich quick schemes or romantic overtures. This is Zsa Gabor, and she certainly tuned in to the voice of 9 different husbands. But at a more serious level, you have Joe Biden, who says that Zelensky didn't want to hear the warnings about the Russian invasion. So we hear what we want to hear. We also hear what we expect to hear. And this is Jacob Van Zanten, and a pilot in Tenerife, 1977, on the runway. He expected to hear air traffic control clearance, really irritated, so not in his normal mindset. And of course, the worst air disaster ever was the result. So we hear what we expect to hear, and science explains this. There's an experiment from a Dutch psychologist that shows people were given a segment of white noise and told every time you hear Bing Crosby's White Christmas, press that button. A third of people pressed the button, and of course, there was no Bing Crosby. We hear what we expect to hear, what we're told to hear, or what we're conditioned to hear. And in business, we also hear what we need to hear, particularly motivated reasoning and motivated listening. All under pressure, we need to hear different messages, find solutions. Elf Aquitaine, desperate to find a solution to their oil problem in the 1970s, welcomed and embraced the messaging and the revolutionary technique from these innovators. They promised this technique would solve their problem. They paid 200 million, and over 4 years, it turned out to be an absolute hoax. So it's not just executives, it's intelligence agencies as well. And so you have Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, interrogated for 4 years at Guantanamo Bay. And he certainly told them what they wanted to hear after 183 different waterboardings. He confessed. He confessed to 31 different events, including 9/11, the World Trade Center bombing, the Bali bombing, the planned assassination of Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Pope John Paul II, the beheading of Daniel Pearl, and the foiled attempts at NATO, New York Stock Exchange, and London Heathrow. How often do we torture the data until it tells us what we want to hear, as The Economist once said? We do. And these are forms of deaf spots. Daniel Kahneman talks about blind spots. What you see is all there is. I extend this to the idea of deaf spots. What you hear is not all there is. And there's a price to pay for this. This is part of what I call the trilogy of error. But at scale, it is certainly a trilogy of terror, because we read about the consequences every day, whether at an individual, organizational, or societal level. And it's not just missed signals and misconduct and miscarriages of justice, it's these unheard voices. Sinead O'Connor once scribbled on a hospital wall, "I only want to be heard." And she wasn't alone. People want to hear you. People want to be heard by you. We all want this, but in this noisy, deafening, overloaded world, it gets harder and harder. And there's a price to pay. There's a price to pay commercially, in terms of the average Fortune 500 company costs them at least 250 million per annum. It all boils down to this fusion of context and cognition, as we've heard about today. This short-term world, this world of present bias, instant gratification, instant reward, mixes with how we think. Of course, we're going to make faster decisions then. Data overload. We're going to be more distracted and overwhelmed. We think in a binary way, in a polarized way, rich, poor, win, lose. It narrows our frame of reference, it narrows our perimeters. And of course, this is exacerbated by a visual, Instagram-oriented, instinctive world where we judge a book by its cover, speed dating, first impressions. All of this combines with our cognition and is amplified by situations of uncertainty, resource scarcity, and stress and general commercial pressure. And there are, in fact, 200 different biases, far too many for us to ever get our heads around. But in actual fact, we need an organizing framework to help us cope with these. And I have aggregated these into 10 different misjudgment traps, really common traps that we experience every day, and they're situation-based rather than anything else. And I use the word perimeters deliberately because it reflects Herbert Simon's concept of bounded thinking. We are more at risk and more liable to error when we're under these particular circumstances. And I think that they're going to help you insofar as they help you look at any current situation, so help you optimize decision-making in the moment. I think you can explain any scandal, any mistake that you've made or your colleagues have made or your family have made in terms of these different traps, so that that understanding can help you prevent future error. So let's look at each one of these, and I would encourage you to think of a decision that you have right now and ask yourself, am I liable to any of these traps? Bearing in mind that each one is a chapter in a book, each one has 7 or 8 different biases within it. But just to give you a high-level view of what these look like. Power-based traps are when you crave power, or you have power and you're desperate to hold on to power, or you're terrified of losing power. And Donald Trump, the example of when he was threatened with loss of power, you had the January 6th Capitol riots. What do you do to hold on to power, to get that power that you desperately crave? Or what do you do when you concede power? This is about authority bias and conformity bias. Or you have ego-based traps, which we're probably all familiar with. And this is everything from the positive belief bias to overconfidence to the illusion of invulnerability. And I give you the example of China's poster child, Jack Ma. He made a speech in 2020 at the Shanghai Bund Summit, and he got on stage and he said, I'm really not sure if I should say this today, but he tuned out the voice of common sense maybe, or doubt, and proceeded to criticize extensively the Chinese government. He disappeared from public life for 2 years, and the biggest IPO in history was pulled. Then you have risk-based traps, which, again, we will be familiar with, and these are all about anchoring, which we just heard about, or loss aversion, or probability neglect. And again, really important here, the certainty bias comes in very much at play. And the delusion of certainty often masks, the dilemma of doubt, which we face every day. I think of Stockton Rush, the CEO of OceanGate. He really believed in his product safety, very much so, but he discounted the voice of 38 different experts that told him it wasn't safe. And he descended 12,000 feet below the surface to view the Titanic, and it tragically imploded. Or you have identity-based traps, which we all care about, our identity, the labels, the Lex title that we have, our desire to impress groups or join an in-group. You want to be the first, the best, the fastest, the strongest. You want to be the person who climbed Everest. You certainly don't want to be the one who turned back. And yet, people don't turn back and pay the price for that. Buzz Aldrin never wanted to be the second man on the moon, and he had a lifetime of certain decisions that he made after that. Or memory-based traps. You're all in the business of memory and salience and availability bias and making sure that people remember your message. We discount not only our own ability to recall events, but we overtrust our customers, colleagues, and other people. This is all about the forgetting curve. This is all about the misremembering effect. And too often you have witness misidentification in a court of law. There are many people who have been wrongfully convicted on this basis. And then you have ethics. Far too long to talk about today, but this is everything from the slippery slope to moral disengagement. And you can think of examples from Theranos to Madoff's Ponzi scheme to the mis-selling scandal. How often here do you, in this industry, and do we exaggerate just that little bit? Or, add another few sentences to your CV. You've got mis-selling. We people do it all the time, but at scale and when it becomes advanced, with too many consequences, I think the implications speak for themselves, and there are many scandals, I think, that verify that. And then you have time, the topic of today. And I should say that all of these have a force multiplier effect. Every single decision that you're making has all of these traps. Different ones in different weightings at different times, subject to context. But the time-based traps, when we're obsessed with the past, the present, or the future, each of them can be a trap, of course, status quo bias or the present bias. And Wall Street is littered with companies that fall into these traps. And I have worked with quite a few of them in my day. Then you have the emotion-based traps, which are all about the different types of emotions that you have. There are 27 different emotions, so you really need to know which ones help you on your way or which ones get in the way. And here I use the example of DuPont's Forever Chemicals, because this is about denial, or the ostrich effect, or wishful thinking. And again, it relates, of course, to the time-based trap, not thinking about the long-term consequences of this chemical dumping. And there are many examples in this space. And then you have the marketeer's favorite, the crowd effect, relationship-based trust, mimicking groupthink, bandwagon effect. We love a trend. Everything from cryptocurrency to lip fillers to solar panels. We like a trend, but we need to know which trend is right and which is the right crowd. And then, of course, we just heard about story-based traps. Do we believe the story or the storyteller? More often, we believe the storyteller, and we rush to judgment, we tune out, we don't think beyond where we should. All of these are related to the different goals that you have. And I've worked through many, many different decisions that people make, and all of these traps are pervasive. They're also pervasive at whatever level of the curve you are at in your career. Success is not any immunity to any of these traps. And you see it. You see it more and more where people get cancelled. And increasingly in today's era, you're more and more likely to get cancelled than ever before. I do suggest that your perspectives really, really matter. Your decisions matter. And your priorities, your preferences, your perspective will change. What's important to you now will, of course, be different over a lifetime. We know that. But the impact of the decisions that you make really can last a lifetime, particularly when they have an effect on other people. At the end of the day, this is about prevention being better than cure. It's about reinterpreting what you hear. It's not just about listening. We all listen. It's about reinterpreting what someone says and not taking it at face value, not just tuning in because it's someone who's popular or familiar to you or someone that you like. So this Cherokee proverb for me, I think, sums it up pretty well. Because this is a time of opportunity. This is a time to, think in time, on time, and over time about the decisions that you make. And it is just a discipline of tuning in strategically and selectively. You can't listen to every voice, and all voices aren't always equal. So I think Abraham Lincoln actually has it right. He says discipline is choosing between what you want now and what you most want. And I think that's incredibly important. Practically, I give you 3 tips for today. Decision friction. Friction's always negative, especially online. But when it comes to decision friction, it is exactly what we're looking for. We heard earlier about faster isn't better. When you create positive decision friction, it allows you to slow down. It's like a mental speed bump for your mind. And it allows you that time to reinterpret, to think about what someone's told you. Whose agenda are they really playing to? Is that fact really right? Where did I get that? All the stuff that you would associate with misinformation. You can also just set decision rules, and a decision rule can be anything that's appropriate for you or your team. Very simply, you can just ask more questions and question more answers. You can decide, I'm never going to make a decision on a Friday, or I'm always going to ask 3 different people. Or you can use the 18 different behavioural science techniques, the sonic strategies that I've outlined in the book. Of course, they start with this process of slowing down to reflect, organising your attention, navigating novel perspectives so that you ultimately calibrate situations and apply the perimeters checklist. And if you can't decide, my TED Talk or TEDx Talk talks about overcoming indecision, which is another hampering for people in their misjudgment. You just don't want this situation. You don't want to have to explain and apologise and have a revenue or a reputation or a relationship hit. I really like this example from the Icelandic drink drive campaign. Think ahead. Who's going to drive you home? The policeman, the ambulance man, the taxi man, or the mortician? This is about thinking ahead. This is about tuning in. This is about recognizing and learning from people who might have got it wrong but have changed direction. I do think of Oskar Schindler and how he tuned into the voice of conscience in that enamel factory outside of Krakow. Or Tina Turner, tuned into the voice of reality after years of abuse and turned her life around. Or you've got brands like Apple, who tuned into the signals in the marketplace and became global super brands. Or even current Taylor Swift, who really tunes in to the voice of her audience and has become a cultural icon. At the end of the day, all of these people appreciate the value of being tuned in. More influence, more trust, and living in an equitable and a better world. I leave you with the example of Winston Churchill's mother. And I think she tells a great story. Lady Randolph Churchill. She tells how she was sitting at a 19th century banquet between 2 eminent British prime ministers. And we've all been there at that table. And she says of her engagement with William Gladstone, I thought he is the cleverest man in all of England. But of her discussion with Benjamin Disraeli, she says, I felt that I was the cleverest woman in all of England. Why? Because unlike Dick Bass, Benjamin Disraeli learned the art of tuning in. He understood what it meant to hear other people and to be heard. And that lesson alone has stood the test of time. I really do believe that if you tune in, you hear what other people don't. You gain a source of advantage that other people just don't have. And not only that, but you do make smarter decisions in time, on time, and over time. Thank you very much.
Come and sit down. Thank you very much, Nuala. I can actually match that Dick Bass story with a colleague of mine, not Mike, a former colleague of mine, who spent 10 minutes waiting outside a music shop on Tin Pan Alley, bragging about how well his music career was going to an elderly man And then finally he said, how about you? And he said, my name's Brian Eno.
No.
So you can have the same thing. Very interesting question here, which has come up on the screen. What's your personal media regime? So I think that's a great question, actually, because we can actually effectively end up in a bubble of our own choosing. Do you have a particular kind of set of rules or principles in terms of what media you consume?
I'm more LinkedIn than anything else, to be honest. Yes, I decided a long time ago, I'm not FaceTime, I don't do Instagram. And it's not that I wouldn't, it's just, it's too much. It's just too much to do them all.
Yeah.
So I focused on one, rightly or wrongly. I do a little bit on Twitter. But I do find, I'll tell you what I have found in this. I have found through this study even that who you tune into, actually, and the voices that you hear, I'm much more attuned to, I suppose, the negativity, as we were hearing early on, from social media. So I try to limit it. I do the ones that I think are relevant, you know, to my work or to my clients. But beyond that, I wouldn't say that I'm a social media junkie by any stretch.
Actually, that's a very good one at the top. The worst decision you've seen, I mean, cases where businesses have taken decisions where really just failing to hear fairly obvious voices, or selective hearing, I suppose, is the question of
well, one of the ones that strikes me most is actually the British Post Office. There are lots, and the book is full of them, but I particularly feel that the British Post Office is a horrendous example, and maybe it's because I work with the Innocence Project, and I've met some of the postmasters, and you cannot but be really moved by their stories. And so for me, at every level, whether it's from and I think everybody made, I mean, we talk about the villages made errors, they made rushes to judgment. I actually translated the perimeters effect using the British Post Office as an example, and I was able to trap whether it was Paul Lavenel's, you know, whether it was the investigators. Actually, I was able to track how many of them had, you know, encountered different biases that explained it. So for me, that's one of the greatest travesties.
Because it really interests me that, in particular, not that it was just a bad decision, but how extraordinarily protracted it was, because people had stopped listening. Now, the one defence you could have is that when you instigate new systems, it's not unusual for them to uncover some degree of fraud, because obviously the people have worked out how to con the previous system, and so the new system catches them out. Now, so actually they had a little glimpse of a reason for believing something was fraudulent. What's weird is that they could patently see no pattern in the people who they prosecuted. There wasn't an urban versus rural, young versus old. I mean, I would have thought basic statistical analysis should have said, look, if this is actually intentional, we should expect to see some kind of pattern. And there wasn't one, because it was random. What was it, do you think, that actually made them... I mean, obviously there's an element of sort of reputational defensiveness and so on, but what was the ultimate thing behind that? Because I think it's worth discussing, because, you know, it's possible. We regard it as egregious, but I think it can happen again, and it can happen elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it was quite a few of them. I think you're right. I think in the beginning you think, oh, well, it's a system. So I think there is a bit of, you know, it makes sense, well, you know, they're rushed to judgment in the beginning, but not over time. And I think the pattern of just constant denial, yes, it was self-interested, but I think if you look at the risk-based traps, I think it was about identity. They were under massive pressure, but I think there was this collusion, and everybody agreed. So that it was the culture, it was a number of different factors in terms of, but I did notice was actually the village effect. So your local postmaster was the pariah very quickly. And with that, which I felt was particularly egregious.
So particularly if you were small, of course you're a sub-post office.
That's right.
So you're small, and very quickly village sort of gossip would go, you never would have guessed, would you, but, and that was it.
And,
so,
And I think, but we've seen that in many places. You've seen it in the McMartin trial in the US, where, you know, a teacher was accused of, you know, sexual harassment with children and stuff, and everybody jumped in and believed it because the messenger was actually the policeman. So and it turned out to be fantasy and inaccurate. But again, you've seen groups rushing to judgment, not just even individuals, but groups, and that herding effect. I think that's come into play in quite a few different examples.
So what's the? I mean, I suppose an interesting question is there a kind of systematized way? Because one of the things I'm conscious of is when we kind of automate processes or systems, or indeed computerize them, we do need to have regular fire breaks. You know, in other words, which prevent effectively a kind of institutional logic running out of control. I mean, what's the way you design those, I guess, is the question I'd ask. Is there a way in which, I mean, what could the post office have done which basically automatically made them ask the question, hold on, actually, let's just bring in a fresh set of eyes. I suppose they brought in the fresh set of eyes, which were the investigators, and then they basically rejected what they said. That's probably fair, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think also that there is the openness and the receptivity to error. You ask any successful person, I mean, it's like the slide I showed. You ask any successful person if they're subject to bias, you know that they say no. Or they might say X and Y. But if you're aware of, I mean, there are 200 biases. If you actually know the names of some of these, and if you can group them into power-related or ego-related, you can at least go down the list and say, well, is it any of these 6 or 7, rather than going, it's bias. It's bias is too hard. And it's too easy for people to say, oh, we're biased. It's just too blanket.
So what your book contains is a kind of checklist you can run through. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always thought there's one advantage of having a kind of monarchy, which is it means your prime minister lives in a house, not a palace, and is slightly less susceptible to kind of, ongoing delusion, if you like, if you have to perform the ceremonial role as well. But I mean, going through that checklist effectively is a really, really good way of saying, is it possible this is playing a role here? And if you run through that checklist with enough self-awareness, you can actually spot the problem.
I think that's exactly it. You look at how you're feeling about any decision, and you say, am I subject to ego or identity, which are kind of easy ones. All you do is go through the list, and once you can label something, we know this as marketeers, when you can label something and point something out, it becomes a lot easier to accept and to learn about, and then conquer, if you like. But if you just label it as bad decision in this broad sweep, you can't do it, which is why I deliberately itemised each of those 10 traps, and they have 7 or 8 in each of them. So you can point to each one and say, is it X, Y, or Z? And then, of course, you can look at the strategies to recover.
And it's interesting to note that the 2 people who really took this stuff seriously were, Warren Buffett and the late Charlie Munger. Were absolute devotees of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Nuala, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you.